welcome everybody. Let's dive right into this. I put way too many slides into this presentation, which is fine. And I'd like to dive into it so that we can cover off as much as we possibly can. Meraki's been an absolutely amazing portfolio since they were purchased by Cisco back in 2012. And I'm curious, that's 10 years now. So how many of you have already had some experience in working in a hybrid environment? And I think you should be able to chat to everybody, I'm hoping. I don't know 100% sure what your experience is like, but I think you can chat to everyone. And if you can, just let me know if you've been using Meraki in a hybrid environment already. I'm just curious because it has been around for 10 years. Oh, there we go. So I can see some of the answers. Now, it looks like you can respond to hosts and panelists. If you can respond to everybody, go ahead and do that as well. But hosts and panelists are good because at least I can see that. And I can always report back to everybody what I'm seeing. And so far I do have an answer. It is that they do already work in that environment. So that's great. Oh, good. We've got any more answers now. And some of you have, some have zero experience. And awesome. So there's a mixture of experiences is what I'm seeing here. Oh, and some people are saying years. Yeah. And so that's good. That means we have a kind of a diverse collection. All right. So for those of you that have been working a little bit already in hybrid environments, what were some of the key challenges that you jumped and bumped into over that time? And again, you'll be able to respond to me and I'll kind of report back to everybody what some of those answers are. So those of you who've got experience, what were some of the key challenges? And as we're waiting for people to reply, I'll share my challenge. And I hear from other people that they had the same challenge. For me, I had been operating iOS-based environments for quite a long time before Meraki was purchased by Cisco. And so I had developed a lot of command line habits and dependencies. And I was really enamored, of course, of debug commands, for example. And, you know, I was quite happy with my show commands as well. But like that was really, to me, that was troubleshooting and really understanding what was going on with my environment was a combination of show commands and debug. And I have to say that transitioning to Meraki, probably the first year, I was probably in full out resistance mode because I lacked those specific tools. And I kind of fought really, you know, against kind of being absorbed by Meraki a little bit until, you know, you kind of reach the point where you go, okay, this is not going to be the old familiar environment. This is a new environment. If I kind of just start from a clean slate and just accept that and then try to troubleshoot within that new environment as best I can, what would that look like? And that change of attitude was really important for me. And it shifted a lot of things. And then I really began to embrace kind of the Meraki way, if you will. And what I kind of discovered in that was I wanted to do show commands for the sake of doing it. You know, like I wanted to, it was working. There was nothing wrong. I just wanted to see it. Or I wanted to do a debug command just for the sake of it. It was working. There was nothing wrong. I just wanted to see it. And so part of my trouble was I was kind of forcing, you know, the commands into Meraki and saying, well, you have to have this. And I backed off and said, well, I only really need this if I'm troubleshooting. And so let's wait for something to go wrong. And then let's see what it looks like to fix it. And then the weird thing that happened was I had to wait quite a while before things went wrong. And that was kind of like the first eye-opening moment, which was, well, this thing kind of works. And again, it depends on the scope and what you're trying to do, because things can go wrong quickly depending on what you're trying to do. But in my particular case, it actually took quite a while until something went wrong. And that was really the first thing where I kind of realized this is kind of easy. You know, that this doesn't take as much effort as it took on the command line world. And I kind of felt they don't need me. Like my knowledge, you know, it's pretty good, but I don't really need to bring all of that to the table here. And not that I want to get rid of the knowledge, believe me. It was just that it was easier to work with Meraki. So I finally started opening up my eyes to kind of what their product was as opposed to what I wanted it to be. And I think that was, for me, one of the big transitions for Meraki. And yeah, and so some people are talking spanning tree was a challenge for them. Other people mentioned some of the VPN issues were a bit of a challenge for them. I've got other people talking about, well, I'd like to kind of figure out the tagging mechanism and how can I leverage that? And that's, Jeff, when you're dealing with large environments, tagging becomes really important, doesn't it? Right? To try and find what you're looking for with any sort of speed and to have some sort of contextual awareness for how related components are operating. So yeah, I understand you on the tagging. And and I've got one response to, well, what was the challenge you faced? And it was simply just integration, which kind of means everything, I guess, right? Was maybe what might have been happening to you. There's a lot of things going on. So anyway, that was my initial impression. I'm glad to see that there's other impressions out there as well. And my goal here is to try and help you understand a little bit about, well, what does that integration look like and what does that troubleshooting look like? I want to make a quick reference here, that Meraki has over 600,000 customers. There's literally over 3 million networks. And so this is a very significant installed base. And not only is the installed base significant, but I also point out that, and I'll get a slide for this, about 78% of the customers that are deploying Meraki, a lot of them also have Cisco already in their environment. Well, and it makes sense, right? Cisco was there first. Meraki only became possible, in the Cisco world anyway. Meraki became possible in about 2012. And it took some number of years after that to really start gathering momentum. But basically, of those 600,000 customers, the vast majority of them, almost 80%, have already got, Meraki, Cisco infrastructure on-prem, and they're really faced with integration. Now, I will also say that Meraki's brought in, at least 40,000, 50,000 brand new customers that were never Cisco customers previously, had never consumed the enterprise side at all. And they were pure Meraki from the get-go. And so there's maybe like 40, 50,000 or so of those kinds of customers that came into the mix. But again, like I said, there's hundreds of thousands of customers with integrated environments out there. And so, and this question is now for everybody, even people who have not run in an integrated environment. So just based on your own knowledge, based on your own understanding of networking, what kind of integration challenges do you think will pop up? And try to be a little specific. I don't need to know, well, the default setting for Cisco is this and the default setting for Meraki is that. I don't need that kind of detail. But if you have like a technology area or a feature/capability that you think would be a really big pain point, what do you think that would be? And it could be across anything. It could be routing, it could be switching, it could be security, it could be wireless. What do you think is going to be like the big bump in the road for you in terms of integration? What kind of capability? And spanning tree, yeah, that's a classic one. I'm pretty sure that spanning tree is a bump in the road regardless of what you're doing, quite honestly. That's one of those underlying mechanisms that's super critical. We kind of ignore it, but if it's not working properly, we get bit really fast with spanning tree. So yeah, I can certainly understand why you're coming up with that. You're right. Well, I would say routing in general. So Robert's kind of provided an answer here that routing, and specifically was kind of static routing, or I guess routing in general even maybe, right, compared to the ASA. So you're right about that. And so that's a Meraki MX/ASA comparison is where you're heading there. And there's a whole category, Robert, of like just differences between the product, right? Different design strategies, different kind of capabilities. It's not really an apples to apples comparison. I can't go up and, hold up a Cisco ASA in one hand and hold up a Meraki MX in the other hand and say, they're the same, except one is cloud managed. That's a really dangerous statement. There's a lot of differences, right? Between say an ASA and the Meraki MX. And that's the crux of our problem, isn't it? That we've got to switch over to this new ecosystem, new portfolio, new mixture of features and capabilities. And even when the capability is the same, like I do spanning tree and you do spanning tree, well, now there's different defaults, right? And that has to be understood, because that leads us into trouble very quickly if we don't understand that. So thanks for the feedback. And I do apologize that you can't see each other's answers. So I'm trying to be a good reporter here and report out what's happening. And so .1Q came up as another potential stumbling block as well. So if I were to kind of talk a little bit about the portfolio, and maybe I'll start with the MX. Yeah, I identified routing as one of those really big critical areas where if you do not understand how routing functions on the MX and how that's different from how it operates on an ISR, how it operates on an ASA, you're going to be in a lot of trouble really quickly in a hybrid environment, or even just a pure Meraki environment. You're going to be in a lot of trouble. Now, what I've done here is I've actually taken some slides from my course that explains all of this stuff in more detail. And so I'm not going to reference every bullet because I'm not trying to deliver the course, but there's a reason why I have the slide, and I want to just speak to that reason. One of the really interesting things, of course, that I love about Meraki, and it's different than Cisco Enterprise on-prem. I have to watch my language. The one thing I really love about the Meraki Cloud Managed is the devices come with a real simple baseline configuration. Now, depending on the device, the configuration is a little more sophisticated. So for example, the Meraki MX, you take it out of the box, it's got DHCP enabled on the wide area network interface, which makes a lot of sense. But in addition to that, it's got DHCP enabled on the local area network side, and it manages a scope. It has an IP subnet that it's already managing as a DHCP scope on the local network side. So it basically is the seed of a functional network because of that. And of course, it's got the basic security posture established for, good baseline security. So it will instantly start protecting any client that you connect to the local area network side is going to be instantly protected when you plug them into an MX. So that's kind of like one of the interesting things that I like about Meraki is these default configs that are with no further setting, they at least get you operational. You get the ability to reach the world with this baseline setting. And as many of you probably know, the other really interesting thing about Meraki is because it's a cloud managed platform, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to call home. In other words, it's going to call to the Meraki data center. It's going to say, hey, data center, this is me. I'm brand new, just out of the box. Here's my serial number. And the data center does a database dip, and it goes, oh, right. Yeah, Raymond has claimed you, and he's claimed you into this specific network. And by the way, he's already set up the configuration for that network. So I'm going to actually give that to you. You're going to download this config. And once you've, implemented the steps here, you're now going to take on the personality that Raymond's designed for you. And he designed that for you a week ago or a month ago, or however long he did it. And so it will then take on the configuration that I've set in the cloud. That's a really important behavior to be aware of when you're dealing with the Meraki gear. And as I said, the default is it's going to run a DHCP server on the local area network, and it's instantly going to be able to give IP addresses to clients on the inside. Now, the classic thing that happens, of course, is you've got a device on the edge, right? So you're all happy. I've got this device on the edge. It's got this default config, or it's downloaded its personality. What I want to do is I want to use this device to connect to the world. And I've got other offices and locations. And now I want to start doing interesting things. And, we'll talk about, VPNs later, but I kind of want to focus on routing here for a minute. And so the first thing that you start thinking about is, well, it would be nice if I could maybe run some routing on this. Maybe I want to establish a VPN to a branch office or multiple branch offices. Maybe I want to enable some routing so I can support communication between all these offices. Let's fire up OSPF. And then you discover that it supports OSPF, but it doesn't actually support OSPF in the way that you think it's going to. So it does not support full OSPF. And I want to get even more precise. It is only capable of advertising via OSPF. It will not receive routes via OSPF. So in other words, if I have another router on the outside and it's running OSPF and it wants to send me routes, the Meraki MX will not incorporate those routes into its routing table. It will ignore the routes that are being advertised via OSPF. All that the Meraki MX wants to do is it wants to advertise its routes. It wants to advertise via OSPF. It's a really interesting half implemented version of OSPF. Now, in the context of Meraki, it makes complete sense. There's nothing wrong with this. This is not a problem. They haven't given you a half functional system. They haven't ripped you off. This is exactly the thing that it should be doing. It's completely rational if you understand how the Meraki design principle has been set up and how you operate in the overall world. And the bottom line idea behind this concept of advertising OSPF but not listening to OSPF is that it is a mechanism which allows it to distribute routes that were learned via other mechanisms and to distribute those routes to another device which is running OSPF. So fundamentally what happens is I may have a multi-point VPN that's been established. There may be non-Meraki VPN locations which are participating because it's IPsec based, so we're hybrid. And when I have a non-Meraki VPN endpoint, it does not participate in a function called AutoVPN. And one of the beautiful things about AutoVPN is it helps to communicate route information among Meraki endpoints. So the Meraki endpoints are all in on the big story of what the networks are because they do AutoVPN. The non-Meraki endpoints that are in that VPN, they don't get that information. They're blind to that. So they have to be told, here's the routes, here's the networks, here's what's reachable, here's where you go in order to get to them. And so that reachability information has to be communicated to these other endpoints, and we use OSPF to help support that. So that's why we would want to advertise the knowledge I have about my route table and reachability and advertise that to a non-Meraki endpoint somewhere else via OSPF. And there's other scenarios where this makes sense. There's data center scenarios where this makes a lot of sense as well. And so it's a really interesting concept, right? And it's one of the first things that I kind of scratched my head at when I got into the Meraki world because, you know, previously my edge device was a Meraki ISR router with security licensing and some additional security hardware as well, because I had upgraded it. And it was kind of an all-in-one edge device for me. And it was a beautiful ISR router, loved it to pieces. And I did all my security configuration and my routing configuration in the one device. And when I replaced it with a Meraki MX, the first, you know, after I got used to the show commands and the debug commands, I had to get used to the lack of full OSPF support. And I had to think about, well, what am I trying to do here with my routing? Do I have to, you know, force my Meraki MX to do full on OSPF? And when I adjust it to the Meraki design approach, it's like, no, I don't need to do that. I can actually achieve my business objectives, which is reachability between multiple locations, right? I can still achieve that business objective. I'm just going to configure it differently. That's all. And so that's a really, really, really big transition that you have to go through because we all have this, well, this is the way I configured it and I want to keep doing it that way. And then you start getting mad when you can't do that. And realistically, what matters is not that you configured it a certain way. What matters is what were you trying to achieve? And can you achieve that through a different configuration and maybe slightly different design? And if so, then stop complaining and implement the design and implement the configuration, and the business requirement that you're trying to meet is going to appear the minute that you stop complaining about the fact that it doesn't work the way it used to. and that it's different. So again, that was one of my big transitions that I had to go through. And once I did that, things got a lot smoother for me. So again, this class is a 3-day class, so I don't really have the ability to go through every bullet here. But I want to mention one more important component around routing, which is, we're used to the administrative distance as being the mechanism by which we decide the order in which routes are preferred, right? So, if I'm directly connected to the router as an interface, my administrative distance is going to be 0. If I'm a static route, my administrative distance is going to be 1. If I'm going to be like RIP, my administrative distance is going to be 120. So we're used to administrative distance as being kind of the criteria, right? For this is how you choose your routes. In combination, of course, with longest match, which is always the most important rule. And when we come over to a Meraki, they don't talk about administrative distance. They talk about, well, yes, there are directly connected, but there's also networks that you learn about because they're supporting client VPNs. There's networks that you learn because they're static. There's networks that you learn about because the auto VPN mechanism has informed you of them. There's mechanisms that you learn about because you are connecting to a non-Meraki VPN pair, and now that's a route that's learned via the VPN, right, via some mechanism. And of course, there's kind of your default behavior, which if you don't have any other, good information on which to go, you're just going to, in the Meraki world, you're going to NAT it, which is kind of like the default route concept in an ISR router, which is, the default route is just going to be send it to the internet, right? If your ISR is connected as an edge device, your default route is everything is on the internet. Here's the next hop. It's my service provider. And that's effectively equivalent to what NAT is in the Meraki MX, except they don't call it the default route. They refer to it as NAT. And so that's the list of routes. And that's the order of execution. So, longest match is always the most important rule. That's always going to be my selector. But in the event that longest match is not helping me, then I'm going to look for directly connected client VPN, static, auto VPN, non-Meraki VPN, BGP, and then NAT. And that's the order of execution for route selection. So you need to know that, because otherwise you could get confused about why is my packet not going where it's supposed to go, or why is it not getting there at all, which is actually what would be happening. So these are some of the things that you ramp up on or have to ramp up on really quickly in the MX environment. And so, there's a lot of other considerations, believe me, but I'm kind of looking at the clock here and realizing I've got 35 minutes left, and I want to be careful, and I want to talk about some other areas. So in the spirit of that, how about switching? And I already kind of see it, because the answers previously were, well, spanning tree, right? And that came up multiple times. Is there anything else maybe related to switching that you think could create a problem or a challenge in an integrated hybrid environment? So you're going to have to troubleshoot it, right? And there is one classic one that, in addition to spanning tree, that you really need to watch out for. And I'm just curious if anybody's run into it yet. It's a feature that would be something that would help you get additional bandwidth, additional throughput, right? You're looking for increased bandwidth between devices, between networking devices. Maybe, yeah, there you go. You got it. So it's too bad that you can't see all these little answers, but Nick is the winner. You were the first one that came up with ether channel as being the correct answer. Saeed, you're a close second, and behind that, literally just seconds after that, is when your answer popped up. So congratulations to both of you. Absolutely, right? Understanding ether channel. And of course, the protocols have to match, as we all know. But not only does the protocol have to match, but we need to make sure that the settings are compatible, that will actually form a channel in the first place. And believe me, the default settings on the Cisco side and the default settings on the Meraki side are not going to cut it. If you simply just enable ether channel and you hope it's going to work, you're going to die. It's not going to work. So you have to make sure that you're configuring exact specific parameters so that it's going to come up. Now, once it does come up, it'll come up smoothly. So that will be good. So yeah, spanning tree and ether channel are two really important things that keep popping up again and again and keep becoming troubleshooting issues in the Meraki Cisco hybrid environment. Yeah, and see, that's the challenge. So Michael's asking a question about whether or not, effectively he's asking, well, how configurable is it? He's got a very specific idea. He wants to know if the priority is configurable, but I really generalize that, Michael, into, well, how configurable is it? And I think you know my answer, right? Because this is Meraki we're talking about. And the idea with Meraki is you connect a Meraki switch to a Meraki switch, you enable ether channel, and it works. Case closed, nothing more to do. Let's move on, folks. Like, that's the design paradigm, right, for a Meraki. And of course, the Cisco design paradigm is you have a Cisco switch and a Cisco switch and 1,000 possible options that you can configure, and you have to configure them by hand, and you better know exactly what you're doing. And that's good because you get all of those options. It's a little bad because you need to know the options, but it gives you incredible control, right? Well, Meraki doesn't have that design strategy. And so a lot of these options that you're thinking about configuring, you can't configure them on the Meraki side. So that's part of the issue that we face in the Meraki world, is the design paradigm is it should just work, right? And you got to kind of accept that. That's the world of Meraki. Now, I also work in the channel, and I work, as we said earlier, I work with sales teams as well as engineering teams. And I'm always really careful on the sales teams to communicate that Meraki is a great solution for many, many, many customers. However, there may be customers who have very specific operating environments, who need very specific behaviors, and who need fine, detailed, granular control over those behaviors. If those customers exist, and they do, they may be better off with the Cisco on-prem infrastructure because that gives them the granular control. And there's many customers like that. But there's obviously 600,000 customers who are saying to the world, I would really just like trunking to work, please. I would just like ether channel to work. If I could just plug it in and click a couple of buttons, and if it works the way it should, I'm really happy with that. And I don't need to drill into the precise detail of exactly what's going on. And again, the default behavior of the Meraki handles the functionality, and it gives us perfectly good functionality, right? So again, I know that you like this feature, but you got to ask yourself, well, what's the business purpose of the feature? And then is that business purpose still fulfilled by Meraki or a hybrid Meraki? And it's only if the business purpose is not fulfilled that it's an issue. If you want to do a feature just because you're used to doing a feature, that's not a business reason. And that's why at the very beginning of the intros, they emphasize the fact that I really focus on that. Because if you keep fighting for a feature, you're going to end up going down a rabbit hole really fast, because that's just not a great way to approach the interoperability between Meraki and Cisco on-prem. It just doesn't work that way. Its design premises are different. And so that's a really big, long answer, Michael, to that. That's a good question. And as we say, right, that's the question that opens up the can of worms. And you can put the can of worms back if you focus on the business. If you don't focus on the business, you'll never put the can of worms back, because there's always something that's not the same between these two worlds. So absolutely, spanning tree and link access control protocol. Specifically with spanning tree, I want to communicate quickly here. RSTP is the spanning tree protocol. It's enabled by default. Now, RSTP is interoperable with PVST, right? PVST, per VLAN spanning tree. RSTP, rapid spanning tree. Another way that you could say rapid spanning tree, it's rapid per VLAN spanning tree. That's really what it is. It's RPVST is really what it is. They just wanted to drop a letter to keep it at 4. And the fundamental difference is, the underlying algorithm is different so that it can more quickly identify a successor interface that's going to take over responsibility for forwarding traffic in the event that the designated interface is unavailable for some reason. And PVST had a rather slow algorithm for figuring that out, which was bad. RSTP has a very rapid mechanism for figuring that out. In fact, it figures it out in advance, and that's good. Or let's say it's better. And so they're interoperable because there's a fundamental complementary behavior between these protocols, but the selection of the standby interface, if you will, is just pre-enabled in RSTP, which is really powerful. So they can interoperate. You can even have a mixed PVST, RSTP, and it'll operate. It won't die. It'll actually keep running. Now, there's a couple of things that you could do that would really hurt you if you are running PVST on one side and RSTP on the other side. And this would really only show up on the Meraki side, is if you were to disable the forwarding of VLAN 1 on a trunk port, and you're trying to run spanning tree, of course you would be running spanning tree across that trunk port, then the interoperability with PVST dies. Like, it'll just evaporate. You will not be able to operate spanning tree if on the Meraki side you filter out VLAN 1. Okay, that's one of the biggest mistakes you can make ever. You'll collapse the spanning tree mechanism. And the other recommendation, which is strong recommendation, is in these scenarios when you're mixing and matching catalysts with Meraki, the idea is that the catalyst should be the root. And that's a really interesting recommendation, because what it also means is if you're migrating from Catalyst to Meraki, then the implication of this is your migration should begin by replacing the Catalyst switches with Meraki at the access layer. And that's where your migration begins. And you keep the Catalyst switch at the distribution layer until the very end. And then when all of the access switches have been migrated over to Meraki, then you replace the distribution switches with Meraki, and then you can go pure Meraki. So that's one of the recommendations for how you operate a migration. And it's based on, kind of the spanning tree mechanisms, behaviors, defaults, and things like that. You also, of course, want to make sure that you set that Catalyst switch to be the root. So you want to change the switch priority, right, of the Catalyst switch. Make sure it's 0 or likely root, which it should already be if it's your distribution switch. Okay, so that becomes really important to do that. And you want to keep that spanning tree diameter under about 7 hops or so. So those are some of the others. And again, I can't go through all of these recommendations, but those are the killer ones that if you don't get that done properly, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. There's only one thing on this page that I want to bring up. And I'm thinking, yeah, here. So the very first bullet is the MTU, right? And not a lot of people know that the default MTU on the Meraki side is 9578, right? So that's a jumbo frame MTU by default. And MTU mismatches are another source of problems, as you probably know, in switch layer 2 environments. And so you need to know this. And if you have older Catalyst switches that are floating around, this is likely a problem for you. And especially if we put the Meraki switches at the access layer and they're connected to servers, and the servers are sending big packets, and then it comes up to a distribution layer where we have a Catalyst switch, which is not operating with jumbo frames, you're going to have serious issues instantly across your entire network at that point, right? So this becomes a big issue potentially quickly. So you want to be aware of that what the default MTU is, and that it's a large value in the Meraki world. And so now for the aggregation, right? So only link access control protocol, or LACP, is supported for aggregation. And it's highly recommended that you do not connect the interfaces between the Meraki switch and the Catalyst switch until after you enable aggregation fully and completely in the dashboard. And then when the dashboard's been configured for aggregation, then cable up the switches and then let the aggregation protocol do its thing. Now, I will be honest, I've often ignored this recommendation. I do it in lab environments all the time. It functions properly. I tend to shut the interfaces down, do the configuration, and bring the interfaces up. And that's a really kind of semi-smart way to do it. If you can't uncable it, is just to bring the interfaces down, change the configs, bring the interfaces up, right? So that's a reasonable strategy if you wanted to do that. And it's not on the slide here, but I want to mention it specifically around LACP, which is the Meraki side is effectively configured in auto mode. And you may know a little bit about LACP. If you have two sides of an LACP connection and they're both in auto mode, well, what it really means is that they're potentially waiting for the other side to propose that there be a link aggregation established, and they're just going to wait forever until the other side proposes it. They will not initiate or propose it themselves. So you have to make sure that the catalyst side is configured for desirable so that it initiates the communications to establish the link, and it will come up properly. But if you set up for just like auto on both sides, you're going to sit there forever waiting for the links to come up. So that's another little glitch that happens with LACP when you're trying to interoperate. And again, I keep looking at my time. I've got about 20 minutes left. Something I want to say here about layer 3 is the Meraki product portfolio has enabled sophisticated routing in the Meraki switch family. So well, I have to be careful with my language. Substantial OSPF support and substantial BGP support are enabled in the Meraki switch. So the Meraki switch, when you get the multi-layer switch, because not every model is multi-layer, right? Lower end models are layer 2. You have to come up, about the 2300 series to get into multi-layer switches. They're capable of BGP and OSPF. Now, I will also kind of jump in here. It's not full OSPF. Now, it's much better. It's send and receive, but some of the limitations, for example, is the Meraki switch does not support virtual links, which if you know a little bit about OSPF, it means that every area has to be connected directly to area 0. And there's no mechanism that will support an indirect connection to area 0, okay? And that's what a virtual link is, right? It's an indirect connection from one area to area 0. It basically has to transit through another non-zero area. So that mechanism does not exist in the Meraki switch world. Okay, that's one example. And another example, which is not as, worrying, if you will, is it only supports the network type of OSPF network, which means that it supports only broadcast for its OSPF communications, which is fine because you're not going to be running frame relay or X25 on a Meraki switch anytime soon. So you don't need any of those more esoteric network types generally when you're dealing with a Meraki switch. And that's fine. But you do need to understand, right, that there's certain features not enabled. With respect to BGP, for example, there's a wide and very rich ecosystem of metrics in the world of BGP that are responsible for route selection. And of course, hop count or path cost, basically, right? Well, what's the best way to say it? Yeah, well, the number of autonomous systems, right? That's fundamentally what it is. So counting the number of autonomous systems that are between where I am and the network I want to reach, the smallest number of autonomous systems is preferred, right? So we call them cloud hops. So the smallest number of cloud hops is preferred in the BGP environment. Like that's the primary metric that's used by the Meraki switch. It doesn't have 500 other metrics that you can possibly manipulate or configure. And if they're, included in an advertisement, they'll simply be ignored. Okay, it just doesn't care. It cares about the AS path, right? And it wants the smallest AS path possible is the preferred route. So, things like that are important to know in layer 3 on the Meraki switch, how they deal with the routing protocols. So, and believe me, right, there's other considerations that we're not even bringing into the conversation here. What about the wireless world? What do you think would show up? Thank you, AS path. I appreciate that, Michael, keeping me honest in my jargon. I love that we work together here as a team on this. So how about the access point wireless world? What kind of pebbles in the road do you think are going to pop up there? And again, you can do the chat window system and deal with that. So as you're thinking about what your answers might be, and I'll report them when I see them, is the first thing that you need to wrap your arms around is that the design paradigm for Meraki is that the access points are managed via the cloud. And the cloud is capable of managing tens of thousands of access points. I've worked with clients. One of my clients had 12,000 access points on a global basis. And another client had in excess of 22,000 access points within a single state. Okay, so I've worked with certain companies that have had just amazingly large wireless environments, like massively huge wireless environments. And in many instances, hybrid, because they didn't just, switch over to Meraki. You don't switch 22,000 access points in a single day. Like that doesn't happen. It took them some time to do this. They had to coexist. And so really, there's not really that much integration that's going to occur between your Cisco on-prem wireless and your Cisco cloud managed wireless. I mean, fundamentally, wireless is one of those areas where if you have different devices and their management paradigm is different and unique, there really isn't interoperability, right, between them, in the sense that they don't cooperate in any kind of purposeful way. They might coexist, and we can reduce the conflict of the coexistence, but effectively, there really isn't interoperability, right? It's just the nature of wireless that's how it would be. And this is not just a Cisco thing. This is really a universal behavior. And the reason that this behavior exists universally is because, you have to choose how you control, manage, and operate your access points. And once that choice has been made, that kind of sets in stone what it's capable of talking to and how you talk to it. In the Cisco Meraki world, it's a cloud managed controller. All of these access points, whether they're indoors or outdoors, they're all managed from the Meraki cloud. Every single access point that you see here would establish its own unique and personal SSL stream to the Meraki cloud, and it would establish a 1 or 2 kilobit per second kind of data feed between the access point and the cloud. And that's its point of communications for management purposes. Communicates to the cloud. Every Meraki device does this, by the way, but it's particularly important to acknowledge this in the access point world, because we have so many, controller-based designs and so on. And we have to get our heads past that and into cloud-based and cloud-managed access points. So fundamentally, also what's happening is there's a large amount of decision-making that's invested in the access point. So I don't need to backhaul the user traffic to the cloud, analyze the user traffic in the cloud, make a decision, and then tell the access point what to do. That is not the mechanism. Meraki is very careful to tell everybody, we do not backhaul customer traffic to the cloud. Customer traffic stays on network. Management and telemetry goes to the cloud. So So that's a really, really important concept, right? And so because of that, there's still a lot of intelligence in the Meraki access points. The difference is they're managed and configured from the cloud. So I have consistency of configuration, consistency of settings, consistency of behavior, right? All of those things will maintain their consistency. And the cloud ensures that. And I manage from the cloud to make it happen. But the moment by moment, packet by packet decision is happening on board. And it's happening on board the access point with no backhaul for the user data. And very important to kind of understand that, because anything other than that would violate the promise that Meraki's made, which is we don't backhaul user traffic to the cloud, right? And that's an important privacy promise that's made. So in the Meraki world, in addition to this kind of operational behavior, right, where there's no where the controller is cloud-based, there's some recommendations that many people have challenges dealing with. One of the recommendations is there shouldn't be more than 3 SSIDs that are ever enabled on a single access point. And I've run into many, many, many customers that are running 4, 5, or 6. Now, you probably know a little bit about wireless, and you know for every wireless network that I operate, even if that network is quiet from a client point of view, the access point still has to invest a certain amount of time and bandwidth and traffic in, control messages, advertisements, and other kinds of management overhead still have to occur on every SSID, whether or not the client is connected. So if you have 6 SSIDs and 3 of them are kind of dormant, but it's still active and enabled, then you're wasting the time of your access point. And you're actually impacting the bandwidth and the throughput and the capacity that's available to the active SSIDs. So not only are you wasting your time, you're harming everyone else. So you really want to keep the number of SSIDs down, and you never want to have an SSID that's enabled but not active. Never do that. And so that challenge is a difficult one for many customers, because I know a lot of customers, they have an SSID for voice, they have an SSID for guest, they have an SSID for standard corporate data, but then they have another SSID for IoT devices, and then they have another SSID for some special purpose that was established that we can't even remember anymore why we put that up there. And so you end up with like 5 or 6 SSIDs in that eye blink in a lot of environments, and it's just bad behavior. So the idea is you need to know how to get around it. And in the Meraki world, you get around it by using group policies. In the Cisco enterprise world, you would get around it by using SD access. Okay. And you can actually have a hybrid environment of Meraki and Cisco, and you can still use tagging. You can use packet tagging. And basically you can extend the SD access environment into the Meraki ecosystem, not from a management point of view, but just purely from a tag compatibility point of view. The tags are compatible between the way that Meraki tags the traffic and the way that Cisco SD access tags the traffic. That tag is compatible. You still don't have common policy. You're going to have to establish the policy separately. You don't have common management. You're going to manage it separately. But if you manage it consistently in such a way that the tag is consistent between the two worlds, you can effectively get SD access end-to-end through a hybrid Meraki Cisco environment. And a lot of people don't know that that's even a possibility, right? That they support the packet tagging. And I'm not talking about VLANs here, right? We're talking about SD access. We're talking about special tag that denotes special handling on a device-by-device basis throughout the entire network. In that kind of design, you don't even need to have VLANs. You can just have a single network, and the tagging is what's going to isolate, separate, and direct the traffic, right? That's incredibly powerful. That's SD access. And again, it's interoperable at the tag value level, which is good enough to make it work, but not enough to make it integrated. if that makes sense to you, right? Like you don't have integrated management when you do that. So that shows up. So again, group policy is the way that you do that, like in complete just standalone mode. If you're trying to implement the idea of packet tagging and you want to reduce the number of SSIDs and you want to reduce the number of VLANs and all these other behaviors, then you can use group policies and packet tagging in the Meraki environment to achieve that. And that's really powerful. And it'll shut down on the number of SSIDs. And it will position you for an eventual integration with SD access on the Cisco side if you do that. And of course, you need to have radius servers, which in most instances will be an identity services engine, will be the device that helps to participate in this. And so the complexity of your environment has to go up in order to gain access to this functionality. And that's the only downside of it. And the other useful fact, I guess, to know about Meraki is that every access point is capable of operating in mesh mode. And the default configuration is that mesh mode is permitted. Like you can disable mesh mode completely if you want, but the default is it's permitted. So if for any reason an access point loses its Ethernet connection and it can no longer communicate back to the cloud via its Ethernet connector, it'll simply communicate to adjacent access points, and effectively using the repeater mechanism, it'll backhaul its traffic across the wireless link. And then hopefully that next device will have its Ethernet cable that's functional. And then you'll, be able to continue your journey to the cloud. And of course, you'll suffer potentially a 50%, right, reduction in throughput every time you go through one of these hops, but at least you're still connected, right? So, that's on by default. And by the way, it takes bandwidth and overhead to operate the control mechanism for mesh wireless networking. And if you don't want to have mesh wireless networking, you can turn it off, and that will save you a little bit of airtime if you were to do that. And again, this is not interoperable with the AeroNet portfolio or the Catalyst portfolio. It just doesn't work that way. The one conversation that's come up around this is, if you are going to be migrating from one to another, so you're migrating from, say, AeroNet and you're going to migrate to Meraki, there's kind of a physical migration strategy that you can follow. If you're in a multi-floor building, migrate one floor at a time. Like just completely migrate an entire floor is one of the recommendations. If you can't migrate a single floor at a time because it's maybe too big, then migrate it in a contiguous area. And the word again is contiguous, which really is just a fancy way to say that make sure that the area that you're migrating is a complete area that doesn't have little islands of, access points that are 200 feet down, 300 feet down the other hallway. You want to do it in a coherent area, which is connected, and you could literally draw a circle around it, and that would encapsulate the entire area. And inside of that circle would be nothing but the Merakis that you migrated to, right? That's what a contiguous area is. You're migrating it in such a fashion that you're picking a slice of the floor plan, and you're migrating that entire slice of the floor plan, and you're migrating that to Meraki. And then at the edge, if you still have Cisco AeroNet on the other side of that, now you've got an edge problem, and now you've got to reduce the power potentially of the access points that are on the edge, both on the AeroNet side and on the Cisco Meraki side, to make sure that you're not going to be interfering. And now you've got to watch out for that. And you're going to operate two separate wireless managed environments. They can still connect to the same VLANs. They can still leverage the same authentication mechanisms. They can still both leverage 802.1x if that's what you do. You're still going to be able to connect. Roaming is going to be very wonky. It's not going to be seamless roaming at all, but you will be able to disconnect completely and reconnect on the other side. So it'll be very kludgy, but you won't need, if you keep the authentication mechanisms consistent, you won't need to get the users too involved in it. They'll be able to kind of make it work, but they'll complain that things drop or it seems a little weird on the edge. And you'll have to manage that by managing the radio parameters. So that's how like a physical migration is really, that's where the issues show up in the MR world, is when you're doing the physical migration from AeroNet to Meraki. That's where you've got to handle the strategy, because there really isn't interoperability between the two, right? They're two islands, they're two separate worlds. And I'm not going to do this because I'm noticing that I don't have that much time left, but I just wanted to let you know that, you know, you can plan for migration. You can plan for interoperability. As we've already talked about, you know, migrating the access switches as the first step is a clearly strong recommendation, is a great strategy for you to follow. We would have to talk about your wide area network and your headquarters and your branch offices to figure out what that strategy would look like, because the different scenarios matter, right? What are you going to do? You're going to have enterprise at headquarters and Meraki at the branch. Are you having Meraki at headquarters with Cisco Enterprise at the branch? Are you looking to implement VPN services? Is it full mesh? Is it hub and spoke? There's a lot of considerations. You need to know what your topology is, what your use cases are, and what business is being supported by those use cases. You need to define that out. And in doing that, when you define that, you could then start thinking about, okay, if I'm going to do a hybrid environment, what's my integration goals? Are there different timeframes and different goals that I'm going to be implementing? What is it that I need to do to each one of those phases in order to execute on those goals, right? And then what are the configurations that will support that? And then, of course, you need to test it, roll it out, validate it, and, you know, tweak it if it's not working out the way that you thought it should. So just really briefly, you know, it's not impossible to get these two worlds to work. And I will do a head nod to this piece just really quickly, because like I said, this was the biggest challenge that I personally had when I moved over to Meraki, is they moved my cheese and I was very upset about the whole process. And so this is actually a production Meraki environment right here. It's a very small environment, but it's a production environment. And if I want to, one of the beautiful things about Meraki is I can come out, I can go to the topology page, and I can get situational awareness immediately. And again, it's a small network, but I've got immediate situational awareness. I can hover over devices. This would be a better example. Hover over devices and I can see what they are. And by the way, this is not a problem with the interface. I'm on a Mac computer and I can zoom and unzoom. Just this is a Mac feature. So it's the Mac feature that made that a little wonky. It works perfectly fine if you're not doing weird things with a Mac. So I just wanted to make that note. So I can hover over these devices. I can even hover over the interfaces and I can see what's going on. So that's really powerful, right? To be able to do that. And I can also get a layer 3 view here. I need to get out of my Zoom. So now I have a little bit of idea, right, of what my layer 3 environment looks like. So really powerful for situational awareness. So that's when I started kind of going, this is pretty cool. Now, another thing, if I were to go into my wireless environment, you know, the kind of situational awareness that's available here in the wireless environment is actually really amazing. Now, this is only looking at the last hour. So if I were to maybe tell it to go look at an entire week of connection, it might be a little bit more interesting. So what's happening here is I can tell my system, I need to know how my environment's been for the last week, which was really easy for me to request that. Now it's got to go back to the cloud. It's going to do a bit of a database dip. And funny enough, I don't have any failures, that's probably what you were hoping for somebody who's giving a lecture like this, that they're not operating in a really miserable environment. I'm kind of sad, actually. I wish I did have some failures. But you can see that I can see if there were a failure, it will be reported as to what phase of the wireless communications, step did that failure occur. This is amazing situational awareness to be able to see that. I can see all my connection issues, my anomalies. There's incredible information that's available to you in the world of Meraki. And so, once you kind of understand that I've lost debug, I've lost show, but look at what I've gained. And there's just an amazing number of tools like this scattered throughout the system that gives you fantastic situational awareness. And again, the 3-day class that we have goes into more detail and explains how to troubleshoot. In fact, that's a big part of the 3-day class is troubleshooting. And you can see, right, this is my VPN and I can, again, get situational awareness for what's happening. So that's really, for me, an important note to make about Meraki is they moved your cheese, but they've also upgraded your cheese in some ways. And I think if you kind of acknowledge that within the paradigm of Meraki, where they don't want to mess around with granular details like the on-prem does, then they've really done a fantastic job. And there are so many more considerations. That's why Sunset has the Cisco Meraki hybrid network troubleshooting class, 3 days worth of just fun and joy of walking through an amazing amount of detail, as you probably have a feeling, given how much I tried to push into this seminar. And also, the lab environment is a hybrid environment, right? We've got ISRs, catalysts that are integrated with MXs and MS switches and MRs. And there's even a challenge where we start off with a full-on Cisco world, and this little client in the bottom right-hand corner communicates to the outside world via Cisco. And at the end of the class, this client is going to be disconnected from the catalyst switch, and it's going to be communicating wirelessly to the access point and then getting to the outside world via the Meraki pathway. And we basically walk you through how to make that happen. And in making that happen, we stumble upon pretty much every problem that you would run into in a hybrid environment shows up at one place or another. And that's the class that we created for you, which is the 3-day long version. And this breathless webinar that you just went through was really just a few highlights of all of that. Thank you for putting that link in there. And Jeff, I see your question. Management does not have to happen on VLAN 1 in the Meraki environment. There's a strong argument to be made that you would want to move to a separate VLAN for that and just kind of like abandon VLAN 1, which that's been a security recommendation, by the way, for decades, that we should be abandoning VLAN 1 for management purposes and for data purposes. We should just leave it be. And no difference in the Meraki world, and it's absolutely possible to effectively abandon VLAN 1 and manage on another VLAN. And really, it's recommended and has been recommended for decades that that's how we do it. And yeah, Robert was telling me to extend my time. I'm going to have to go a whole month, Robert, I think, to find the problem. And I think I've answered the questions that I see here. Are there any final questions? I'm fine. I don't have to go running away to a meeting, and I know I'm over by a couple of minutes. So I'm okay here. If somebody has a question, I'll stick around and I'll deal with that. You can either put it in the general chat or you can put it into the Q&A chat. It's your choice. And
while you guys are thinking about that, I did just want to share one quick promo that we're running right now. So actually, Raymond, if you don't mind if I screen share.
Yeah, we have promos. Tell me more.
We do. Let's see here.
I didn't even know. Is this something I should do?
You're about to find out. So this new course that Raymond just mentioned, the CMNT course, it's a 3-day course, and we do have a couple guaranteed to run dates coming up, June 1st through 3rd, August 24th through 26th. And I know we're about to put out dates actually through the end of the year as well. But kind of as a thank you guys for attending today, we are offering a 20% off promo code. So this is valid through June 30th. So you just have to register before that date, and you'll get that 20% off on your registration using code CMNT20. So again, the recording of this session will be sent out early next week, and we will include this promo code in there as well. And the link we'll include it in the email, and I did just put it in the chat as well. So that's all I had. If you guys had any other questions for Raymond, go ahead and chime in. Use the Q&A or raise your hand and Raymond can unmute you. Besides that, I think that's all we had. So we'll just keep this open for a couple more minutes, and then thanks for joining us.